So this week I studied a source that made me look at the Parsha this week and actually at the entirety of the book of Genesis in a totally different light. And not surprisingly, that source was the Zohar, the Jewish mystical text upon which Kabbalah, all Jewish mysticism, is based. You have to only read a few pages of the Zohar to realize that you are in a vastly different universe than the Talmud, which is in a vastly different universe, of course, than the Torah. And we have the luxury of walking into a Jewish library and picking and choosing which era, which city, which rabbis we'd like to sit down with based on our whim at that moment. And so, this Parsha VaYeira, that means, and he appeared. Who appeared? Of course, God appeared to Abraham in the form of the three angels that approach, is essentially about the revelation, the moment of revelation for Abraham. Even more so than the commandment that I talked about a few weeks ago, Lech Lecha, go forth, that Abraham listens to. In this moment, in the moment of Abraham's pain, 99 years old, just performed a self-circumcision. I'd imagine he was not feeling too good at the moment. He looks up and welcomes three visitors who are angels. And the Zohar begins with a text before talking about the revelation, and the text is from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which is no surprise because the Zohar is by nature a sexual text, and so it constantly chooses Song of Songs over and over again because of the themes that it produces. Hanitzanim nir'u va'aretz, chapter 2, verse 12 of Song of Songs. The blossoms have appeared in the land, the time of pruning has come, the song of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The green figs form on the fig trees, the vines in blossom give off fragrance. Arise, my darling, my fair one, come away. It ends, lechi lach, come away. And it goes on to explain the possibility that the entirety of the Torah is, or at least the book of Genesis, let's just say, up till this point, is about producing fruit. Right? Everybody's nodding their heads. That makes complete sense to everybody. Nobody's nodding their heads because it makes sense to nobody, as it made sense not at all to me. The entirety of the Torah is about producing fruit. We start with a narrative about a piece of fruit between Adam and Eve. Right? They see a piece of fruit and they want to eat the piece of fruit. And it's not only about fruit in the sense that quite literal fruit, it's about the fruit that Adam and Eve produce are essentially no good. Their sons come to kill one another. 10 generations later, God decides to choose Noah and reset the world, destroy the world, start anew. And the only problem is that in starting anew, Noah's fruit is also no good. He's married to a wife whose name is Noah's wife, probably, right, not much to remember there. And their kids, in the moment of beginning again, mess up in the beginning moments of the new world. In the last Parsha, God gives Abraham and Sarah both a blessing at the same time. At the same time. Because it's actually going to be the first time in the Torah when fruit is produced that's acceptable to God. And that's going to be in the form of Isaac, who arrives in this Parsha today. One could read about the three angels and imagine that the revelation is the three angels walking in to Abraham's tent, but actually the revelation in the world, the groundbreaking moment, literally earth-shattering, is that Isaac shows up and he's a decent human being. And if you don't believe me that it's really about this generational experience, The parsha begins with the announcement about Isaac, and it ends with the announcement about Rebekah. That there is, in fact, going to be a wife, and that this idea of the fruit of the Jewish people, of the people of the covenant, is actually going to move forward again. If somebody had told me that all of Genesis was about Isaac and his appearance, I wouldn't have believed you. Because Isaac is pretty much the most boring, vanilla, parv character that the Torah has to produce. All of us know his name. I would dare anybody to stand up and say something about him other than the fact that he ends up being blind at the end of his life. And yet the Zohar wants us to relate, out of all of the characters that we meet in this parsha this week, to Isaac, because we're not going to live up to Abraham or Sarah, most likely. But the possibility that we have in producing the next generation, that's our story. The creation narrative that began weeks ago in Genesis 1, with God creating the world and the world full of possibility, we hold that story in our hands, in our own way, to produce a better world of tomorrow. Each generation, beginning with Adam, are people who work the earth. Right? I've said many times from this bima that the profession of good Jewish boys and girls is not doctor and lawyering. No offense to doctors and lawyers here in the congregation this morning, right? Good Jewish profession is being a shepherd, clearly, if you read the Torah, right? All of us should be shepherds. And Abraham is not somebody who works the earth. And a twist of irony, as the Zohar points out this morning, he is not someone who picks fruit. He is someone who raises cattle and sheep. The first of this kind that we're introduced to in the Torah. He is a very different profession. And his flocks grow over the course of his life. Everything that he touches, Abraham, becomes a success. And in this way, the most successful thing that he leaves us with is the idea that we're part of his story. Because it's through Isaac, through Rebekah, and that narrative begins this week, that we understand that this isn't a story about one family frozen in time who were very special. It's actually the story about all of our families, all the time, who are perhaps special in moments, right? We will all have good stories to tell in the right time. But we know through this story this week, that the idea that the fruit from the tree is going to be bad and that the world will collapse, that's no longer the story of the Torah. Isaac and Rebekah changed the narrative drastically. Dale, you weren't supposed to press that button. It was a few more minutes. From creation to the flood, Dale, press it now. To the flood, to the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and Leah. We have room to find ourselves. And in finding ourselves in the Torah, we taste the sweetest fruit possible. Shabbat Shalom.